Many may have a difficult time determining a course of action to follow in this time of crisis for the church. However, our Lord did leave us a method by which we can judge. He said specifically, "By their fruits ye shall know them. An evil tree cannot bear good fruit, and a good tree cannot bear evil fruit." I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. We'd like to consider the post-Vatican II Church from the perspective of morals, dogma, and worship. We believe that the only conclusion one can come to after such a consideration is that this church is not to be identified with the Catholic Church. In fact, it is a non-Catholic sect, and that the only recourse is to follow the injunction of St. Paul. Therefore, hold fast unto the traditions which you have received, whether by word or by epistle. With me today to discuss By Their Fruits Ye Shall Know Them are Father Martin Skierke from Great Falls, Montana, and Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Cleveland, Ohio, and publisher and editor of The Roman Catholic. Reverend Fathers, I think if we may consider morals to begin with, an ongoing scandal within the post-Vatican II Church is the annulment situation, and I think there can be no better way to begin than to read a letter we received some time ago from one of our viewers. Here's what she said. She said she watched one of our programs, this viewer, and she says, quote, "And it reminded me of what the real concern the new church really shows for its faithful. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine told me about the annulment the new church gave to the husband of a friend of hers. This couple has 8 children, and the wife was a faithful Catholic. Her husband had a relationship and left her and their children for another woman. Then he applied for an annulment. The new church was so concerned for his happiness that they gave him one. Now, I would like to ask, what concern did they show to his faithful wife and his 8 children, whom he rejected for another woman? The one who was faithful to her vows and to the church. What an insult. The new church rejected her and made her husband's adulterous affair legitimate. Don't you think that the people who keep going to this new church are giving their approval to these terrible crimes against the faithful Catholics when they go along with this new religion when I stand for? I just thought I'd write and tell a true story of how the new church treats faithful Catholics. My understanding is that there's just been an absolute explosion in annulments since Vatican II.
That is actually the case. Every traditional Catholic priest comes across them more often than they'd like to remember, that people have received annulments from the new church, and they grant them rather easily. I could, in fact, give a couple, I don't even have to know who they are, I could tell them, say this, this, and this, do this, this, and this, and then present themselves to the conciliar tribunal, and they can very easily and very shortly get an annulment. It's a fact that can't be disputed. In fact, they grant annulments from year to year more abundantly and almost more easily. I was reading recently that Weekland in Milwaukee, who made the remark that virtually we can annul every marriage. So there you have the answer. The bottom line is that they have contempt for the sacrament of matrimony. Farther yet, they have contempt for God's laws.
I have my own personal experience. My brother at one point, quite a few years ago, maybe 15 years ago, 16 years ago, applied for annulment. And the conciliar tribunal wrote him a letter saying, you know, you have to complete these forms and send this information or we can't proceed with your annulment. So he said to himself, look, this is a joke. I have no grounds for an annulment. He ignored it. A couple months later, he gets a letter saying, essentially, congratulations, your marriage has been annulled.
I ran into a case like that in LaGuardia Airport while I was standing in line to get to an agent at the ticket counter. One of the airline officials actually walked up to me, a woman, I would say, in her late 40s, I would gather, and just asked me out of the clear and blue, "Father, could they annul my marriage without even telling me?" And my reaction was, well, they do whatever they want to these days. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Well, I've been married to a gentleman for," I forget how long she said, it was about 10 years or so. She said she had 4 children. And suddenly her husband decided that he was interested in someone else. And so he simply left the family. And he left off with another woman. And he had gone through a number of other so-called relationships this way. But now he wanted to marry a younger woman who was a practicing Novus Ordo Catholic, and she wanted a church wedding. She couldn't have it, though, unless he got his real marriage annulled. And so the fellow at this point decided to try for an annulment so he could give a church wedding to his new bride. And as a matter of fact, he went through the whole process. The woman was not even aware of it, his real wife. She simply received notification in the mail some months later that they had annulled her marriage without asking her a single question. It's beginning to sound as though it were a business. And as Father Skierke pointed out, I mean, they seem to have the attitude that they can annul any marriage. Now, I mean, honestly speaking, some dioceses are different, some tribunals are different, some would be more conservative, some liberal. But nonetheless, the grounds on which they're granting annulments are so liberal, and the new Code of Canon Law has canonized these liberal grounds, that even the most conservative tribunal now is suspect in the reliability of the grounds that they allege. It really does undermine the whole concept of the sacrament of matrimony, of which our Lord said, "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder."
You know, we can, and I'd like to bring up some more examples of the post-Vatican II Church, some of the, sacrileges and outrages against morals, dogma, and worship. One of the problems we always run into is when these examples are brought forward is that, well, this is just a radical minority. You always have a rotten apple in every bunch. You can't, take a specific case and draw a conclusion to the whole structure. We have one of our viewers told us of a situation in their parish where at one time they went to a car wash which was sponsored by the parish and the nuns were washing cars in bikinis. And they were shocked by such a thing, and they came to the pastor and they brought this to his attention, and he essentially said, "I don't want to hear about it." Now, the reason I mention this is that people, I'm sure, are going to say, well, look, that's just one example. I'm sure this kind of thing happens often, but it's interesting to note that this example is set right from the top, because John Paul II in 1984 went to Papua New Guinea, and he concelebrated the new Mass with a group of cardinals, and the reader was a New Guinean college student who was dressed in traditional dress. And I saw this picture in the newspapers, and she was nude from the waist up. What's worse, the nuns in bikinis or John Paul II with this person, in his position, having her as a lector?
The example does come from the top up. I've seen photographs, too, from Reuters news photo service, which show acrobats, circus acrobats, performing right on the stage in the audience hall. Women with bare midriffs going through acrobatic contortions right in front of his throne there. And it shows him standing there watching with a rather amused look on his face. What a terrible example. Right. What a terrible example. And I think the worst part of all is that he portrays himself as being a Marian Pope, as though the M on his crest actually stands for Mary. But this is the example of immodesty that is approved publicly, and it goes directly contrary to what Our Lady said at Fatima.
We have an interesting letter, which I'd like to share with our viewers, from a viewer in the military. He wrote as follows: "Dear Reverend Fathers, enclosed, please find my contribution." He said, "I too am greatly saddened by the crisis in the Church. In fact, when I was in the Air Force, one Mass I attended, I was shocked to see in the sanctuary a statue of our Blessed Mother on a pedestal along with the symbol of the New Age, a crystal. I could not believe what I saw. I was more astonished to hear the Catholic chaplain praise the crystal as he held it up during the sermon. What was more disturbing was the fact that the chief of all Catholic chaplains, two-star general, was in attendance and said nothing about this sacrilege. This was in 1989, and I'll never forget it. I have other stories of abuses by Catholic priests and lay people alike.
It's just yesterday I was talking to a fellow who told me that in his parish church in Virginia, I believe, the priest put up in the sanctuary, as if they still had a sanctuary, they've really done away with that, but he put up a quilt in honor of the AIDS victims and put photographs on this quilt, and one of the photographs was of two men kissing with the statement underneath, "Read my lips." This was brought to the pastor's attention, and he did nothing about it. But he endorsed this, and this is in the what's left of any semblance of a sanctuary, just maybe 15 feet from their table now. This gentleman was shocked, but as I pointed out to him, I don't find that shocking anymore. What I find shocking is not that a Novus Ordo clergyman of any stripe would have done that, because even if he wouldn't agree with it, he'd be intimidated into going along with it for fear of reprisals from his bishop or complaints from a fringe and radical element. But what amazes me is that you put up with it, I told him. Why are you still going there? Your presence there is an endorsement of this. He's making it possible for this to happen, and it's a gross sacrilege. You know, with regard to the annulment situation, our Lord said that a man who puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery. And then putting her away and she going on and marrying again, he leads her into adultery as well. And St. Paul said very clearly, no adulterer or impure person is going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He said, let no one deceive you with vain words, because there were those then who were trying to tell people it wasn't that bad. Well, he could say the same thing to these poor Novus Ordo Catholics today who are being led down by the primrose path. Let no one deceive you by vain words. These people are not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. You know, we had an interesting example of a situation in Buffalo where the bishop there had interesting themes in a church. And it says as follows: among the various theme windows is the window of non-Christians, which depicts God the Father and God the Son bestowing the blessings on Moses and Mohammed. Also depicted in the window, remember this is in a church, are the falcon-headed Horus, son of Isis, and the whirling, multi-armed Hindu goddess Shiva. Filling nearly a third of the window is Buddha. In the window of Christian ecumenism is depicted Jesus surrounded by people and symbol of the various Protestant sects. A window of prophecy depicts Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Sister Thea Bowman, Dorothy Day, Mahatma Gandhi. The window of the sacred liturgy has a woman holding the sacred host and a female altar boy, a layman holding the missal and an altar boy. The window of Mary, Mother of the Church, depicts the cosmic Christ, a figure who cannot be identified physically as belonging to any specific ethnic or racial background. The window of Christian scholars depicts Father Teilhard de Chardin in the company of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas More, St. Teresa of Avila, and St. Catherine of Siena. The window of the Mission Church as servant depicts, among others, Desmond Tutu and Dalai Lama. It says, in addition to this, the windows as art are horribly ugly, almost ghoulish.
Well, that's not a Catholic church.
Right.
And of course, the people who go there, some of them perhaps in goodwill, and they're disgusted by what they see, and it hurts them to see this happening. The people who go there are mistakenly going to a church that is not a Catholic church. And what their very presence there breeds scandal and a certain indifferentism toward the Catholic faith. They should flee from those places.
You know, I was going to add, too, that people, I find they don't seem to want to face reality and draw conclusions. Because if you draw conclusions, you have to act on them. This is evil, you have to stay away from it. This is good, you have to go to it. They don't want to, in any way, commit themselves because I think in a certain vague way they see what the consequences might be down the line.
Such as what, Father?
Change your lifestyle. We were talking about examples, yet you look at statistics, you go back to your annulments, as I mentioned earlier before the program, in 1969, 700 annulments. 3 years later, 7,000. Year after that, 15,000. So what happens to these people? They are in that situation. They realize it might be an invalid annulment. For them to change, it's going to change their whole lifestyle. And I think rather than do that, they don't want to face reality. They don't want to draw conclusions because of the mere fact the conclusions mean they'll have to act on them.
Well, you know what's interesting, too, is many people of goodwill who are conservative and are shocked by such an abuse, their conclusion will be, well, again, this is a renegade bishop, he's an exception, and of course the hierarchy and the magisterium wouldn't tolerate this. But if we switch to some of our pictures, we'll see that John Paul II was once in front of thousands of people in India, marked with a sign of the adorers of Shiva on his temple, on his forehead rather, that he held this so-called Congress of Assisi where he permitted the Dalai Lama, who is held to be semi-divine by his followers, to place a statue of Buddha on the tabernacle of the Church of San Pietro in Assisi. And, you know, you could go on and on. I mean, he's been blessed by witch doctors. He's participated in interdenominational service. So I think what's important to realize is this isn't just one local bishop. This is coming right from the top.
Right, the bishops are following his lead. There's no question. And they're following his lead in other ways, too. I mean, one day he'll, talk about the glories of the Rosary or the Blessed Sacrament. The next day he'll talk about the glories of Shinto or Taoism or some Eastern mystic cult. And you see, bishops nowadays doing that too. One day they'll appear with a rosary, which shocks many people. And I think that's the real shocking thing, that Catholics are shocked to see a bishop with a rosary. But then the next day they'll show up at a Masonic award ceremony to receive an award for their humanitarian efforts. And it really is, it's worse than if they never touched a rosary in their lives. It would be better if they would just not go near a rosary or a crucifix or anything that looks like real Catholicism, because then people wouldn't be so confused. Then they could say, look, this man is completely gone. He does everything Catholic except, I should say, he does nothing Catholic. Let's put it that way. He does nothing Catholic than if he were to do some things Catholic, because it just confuses the people. It misleads them.
Well,
it gives them a false hope.
People are so conditioned, though, that there's no distinction between good and evil, right and wrong. And when they see this, they can't draw any kind of, once again, they can't draw anything from it. They're in a quandary.
Nothing practical.
Nothing practical.
We still have the scandalous situation of bishops such as Rembert Weekland arguing for women in the priesthood. We have the scandalous situation of a Hans Küng, a noted so-called Catholic theologian who's still a priest in good standing who denies the divinity of Christ, and yet nothing is done.
You know, what is the saddest part of all, though, I think, Julius, is that there are a lot of Novus Ordo priests out there who are really suffering from all this, and they want to do what is right. I think they sincerely want to do what is right. I think traditional Catholics have the tendency to look at them and say they should know better. They do know better. They are of evil will. Some of them probably are, due to laziness or whatever else, unwilling to take a stand. But I've met quite a number of young Novus Ordo clergymen who are very, very much pained by what's happening, but they don't know what to do. They don't know what to turn. They don't know where to begin. Of course, I would tell them always, well, you have to stop feeding the monster, and you have to get back to practicing the traditional faith. You can't be half Catholic and half not, half Catholic and half modernist. That really is a monster, because the two things are incompatible. They just have to get back to practicing the traditional Catholic faith from beginning to end, and have nothing to do with the modernist changes that took place in the Church.
You know, we've often talked about the new Mass, and here we have a picture of a so-called clown Mass. Now again, I'm not saying that a clown mass is the order of the day, but it happens often enough, and rarely, if ever, is anyone disciplined. But do you think that this clown mass is a natural consequence of Vatican II and its liturgical reform? And not considering for a moment the clown mass, what about the so-called new mass in itself, which is a central act of worship in the new church?
Well, the new Mass in itself is subject to interpretation. Remember, the new Mass came out under the aegis of multiculturalism, and it's a creature of the modernist complexus of all heresies. Well, that's what St. Pius X called it in Pascendi Dominici Gregi, since the encyclical of 1907. And so the whole idea behind the new Mass is that it is supposed to lend itself to expressing the local culture. It's supposed to be plastic, because the divine reveals itself in cultures, world cultures. And so the new Mass has been taken and translated into various languages, and it's supposed to be adaptable. It has no real face. It can be twisted and turned into any shape to fit a local culture. So whether you have a clown mass or a very, very dignified Novus Ordo going on in some old relic of a church somewhere with a choir singing the Panis Angelicus, essentially there's no difference, because the theology behind it is the same regardless of the trappings. It's an expression of culture, whether it happened to be a throwback to the Middle Ages as far as they're concerned, or forward to the year 2500, or some aboriginal culture in the bush of Australia. That's fine. They want you to be able to take the new Mass, have it in Latin if you want it, you can do that. Have it in Swahili if you want it, have it in Martian if you want it. As long as it expresses your personal cultural feelings, your personal taste. You've basically created your own religion. Everybody's got his own religion now. I'd just like to say this. The only solution to this whole problem is for people to getting back on their knees and praying to Almighty God for deliverance. This is the result of a moral decline. The surge of annulments, it's the same thing. It's a result of a growth of immorality. And if people don't get on their knees and begin to pray again, they are going to see this happen more and more. The only recourse we have is in prayer to Our Lady of Fatima. And I wanted to mention something about the calendar that Father Skierke issued for 1993, because this calendar, which is very beautiful, has scenes of the Stations of the Cross and the prayers of St. Alphonsus Liguori, the Stations of the Cross accompanying them. And they should be on the wall of every Catholic home, because Lent is coming eventually, and we should be on our knees praying those Stations of the Cross. And I can't think of a better way to bring that to mind, the need for prayer, and praying those stations during Lent in home as a family, or if there's a traditional Catholic church nearby, go there before the Blessed Sacrament. But just be on your knees praying those stations every day throughout the Lenten season. That's what we need.
You know, one thing, I know we brought up a lot of negative examples, and I think it is important to bring that up to convince people that this is a new religion. It is not the Catholic religion. It is not holy. It is not one. It is not apostolic. We got a very, very moving letter from a viewer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who wrote as follows. I viewed your program, What Catholics Believe, early one Sunday morning a few weeks ago. The program discussed the Ottaviani intervention. I would be interested in any information that you can send along on that, and also on Freemasonry. I was raised a Baptist, but feel that I am being led to convert to Catholicism, and would much appreciate a church in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area that you could direct me towards. Lastly, could you explain to me how the Rosary is prayed? Thank you.
Well, we certainly can. What Catholics Believe exists precisely to do that, to get people praying to God. And we also can send them information on modernism. And for that matter, Father Skierke still has some calendars available, too, for those who'd like them for their homes. And I do appreciate them writing in and asking for these things. That's why we're on the air, to make exactly such available to good people.
You've been watching What